Particles of dust float about an until recently unused interrogation room on the outskirts of a small Welsh town. Low crime rate. Nothing of note happens here, day in, day out. At least, nothing that would garner the coverage of the local fish wrapper. And the department's interrogation room represents this, what with its sincere lack of furnishings, housing only a steel table and a single wooden stool where our suspect sits. No camera system, and no tape recorder to speak of. Clearly, a second chair was required elsewhere in the department, likely for some kind of function or social event. So our homicide detective stands in an uncomfortable position against one of the 4 featureless concrete walls. Under their right arm, this detective clutches a manila folder. To circumvent their total lack of preparedness, our detective is fighting with their mobile, a smartphone that they've yet to come to an agreement with. Once the voice notes application decides to work, our detective pushes off from their perch and relinquishes the device. It is placed face up on the cold steel, just inches from the reach of our cuffed suspect. Tired eyes, withered even, dry, opposing our frantic, sobbing suspect. If it wasn't for the aforementioned handcuffs digging their arms into the chairs, they'd probably be flailing. A vision of pure panic. About 20 seconds into the recording, our detective spoke. This interview is now being tape recorded. In a moment, I'm going to take your cuffs off, okay? Please remain seated throughout. We're going to be here for a while, so I don't want any trouble. A brief pause ensued, and our detective leaned over the table, hands flat on the surface as they made sure their device was still recording the events taking place. Then, the restraints were removed. Beneath them, another pair had surfaced in the form of a deep red bruising, where the carbon steel had warped sensitive skin. The detective addressed the suspect as they returned to their previous state, hands flat, arms leaning inwards. "You've already had your rights read to you," they said. "But do you want me to go through them one more time?" The suspect shakes their head, a motion that the detective must first narrate on their own for the audience at home. "Can you please tell me what happened?" A nod from the suspect, a motion left unaddressed on the tape. They rubbed the last few tears from their sunken eyes, bloodshot and swollen. Hands are balled into tight spheres and are pressed into their eyes. Redness turns to blackness, and blackness is accompanied by flashes. Soon, our own vision fades with theirs. You're listening to episode 3 of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, an audio zine broadcasting short fiction once per week, presented by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. The following story contains scenes of a graphic nature and is intended for mature audiences only. From the darkness, we're granted the suspect's vision, a memory read aloud. We find ourselves in a bedsit. Evidence suggests that it has both been well lived in and well cared for by its occupier. In the same vein, however, it is also the scene of their undoing. The images are blurred somewhat, as though our lens has seen water damage, but all the same, we can pick up on the decor as we potter about the location. Holding a special significance to the suspect, a small bedside table comes into view over everything else. Atop the polished veneer sits a collection of identical oddities. Duplicate mugs, several copies of a certain psychology textbook, and a copious amount of wallets. As we traverse these twins like ghosts, we are pulled away from our initial host and are instead placed against a wall to observe the image of 2 people, the suspect and the victim, the former of which sits hunched together on the wet linoleum, knees to chest, palms scrunched to the eyes tight enough to perhaps permanently stop at the images with physical strength alone. We almost miss the latter, as their visage is disguised by a pair of matching leather jackets. Beneath the former bovines pokes the bare flesh of an unidentified limb. The assortment of items suddenly makes sense, but we no longer have time to jump to conclusions. A muffled voice can be heard in the background, as though we're drowning. No matter how hard we try, these words cannot be made out. But it is these words that bring us back to our previous state in time. Dust wakes the nose, and our focus returns to the interrogation at hand. Something about the mood seems to have changed with our arrival. Something that we can't put our collective ephemeral finger on. Still standing with all their education and experience in the same aching position, the detective allows for a moment of silence. It has been a long day. Pulling themselves straight, they punch two fists into their own flesh and shake until an unhealthy crunch is produced from the bones beneath. The moment continues as two sleeves of a dress shirt are folded and raised. On the other side of the table, our suspect's eyes no longer weep for their future. Not 5 minutes ago, the suspect could hardly form words or cease their shaking, but now they slouched before the law. Those eyes, puffed and sore, are pointed square at the detective's right hand. More specifically, they gaze upon a worn leather watch around their wrist. We're drawn to it ourselves. A possible heirloom. Be it old or simply weathered to look that way, it clearly holds a certain sentimental value. An item, perhaps, that one wouldn't want to die without. Like a soldier and their notebook. Naturally, it is the detective that calls time on this break with a straight-up statement. Plain and simple. We know that you are responsible for the death of Remy Boudreau. You know that, right? Prepped and primed, and to our surprise, the suspect shoots back. Yes, I understand. A sigh of relief escapes the detective by accident, but they don't care enough to catch it mid-flight. The manila folder is finally retrieved from the safety of their underarm, and it is placed upon the cold of the table. In its pages, we are offered glimpses into the crime scene via graphic photos, an experience we don't quite deserve after finding ourselves there earlier. Amongst these loose-leaf images sits a printout detailing a brief search into the suspect's personal history, but their name continues to escape our vision. Before this interview began, states the detective, pulling together the drawstrings of their late-night caper, I was given this rundown of your life. Pretty empty, right? The suspect remains quiet. Am I correct in stating that you have little to no previous experience with the police? Yes, says the suspect, and the folder is shut and pushed across the table. Remy was your neighbor, correct? 2 doors down? How did this all come about? Asks the detective. Our attention, so fleeting, grasps solely at the roundness of the suspect's face. It shakes, like they've grown so tired of this investigation already, like their confession should have been enough to call it a day, and for good reason. The suspect gives an answer, but it's anything but solid. Anybody would have done the same in my situation. I well and truly believe that. Your situation? Says the detective. Could you be more clear? Once more, the suspect shakes their head from right to left, but this time, there's an air of distance or a wash of disappointment. Self-defense is suggested, but immediately shot down. A deep intake of air. 8 seconds pass, and the suspect releases the captive void. A fresh palate. They stretch out and gesture towards the detective's watch. A few weeks ago, says the suspect, I discovered that I could travel back in time. We find ourselves taken aback, perhaps more so than the detective. An insensitive revelation which, by all means, should have cost the suspect their time and their phone call. The detective, however, allotted another few moments of their life to humour the nonsense presented, but otherwise was prepared to leave without further questioning. The suspect recounted the events from their own point of view, beginning, as one might expect, with a particularly bad day. For a while now, they had found their mood ebbing and flowing from the township of health. The streets were becoming irreversibly damaged, and no amount of forced taxation on the rest of their person could balance the impending disaster. Foreign aid arrived in the form of a visiting friend, dropping in out of the blue to introduce our suspect to the newest member of her family, a baby girl who would spend the next few hours rolling around on the floor between them. The afternoon soon came about, and, as all good things had, their meeting ended. It wasn't until a few hours later that our suspect would find their friend's wallet atop the kitchen counter. Curiosity, as it so often does, bloomed like our own emphatic vision. Inside, tucked into the traditional plastic window, our suspect finds a small photograph of this friend's youngest daughter. Then, for some reason, Health's dams burst forth, and our suspect falls into tears once more. Too weak to plug the cracks, our suspect defaults to their simple mask of flesh and bone. Damp palms are dug into eye sockets as the suspect attempts to block out the world around them as well as they could, at least until the sinking feeling washed away and their stomach swallowed what was left of their heart. It was not long until the cracks found their way into the mask, and it fell. After what feels like days of sobbing, our suspect is called back to reality by the sound of the doorbell. Her friend had arrived, but she knew nothing of the wallet. In fact, she was just dropping in out of the blue to introduce our suspect to the newest member of her family, a baby girl who would spend the next few hours rolling on the floor between them. Our collective returns to the sanctity of the interrogation room as the suspect's memory comes to an end, explaining that those events would repeat several times, and by the time she'd figured out the trick, she'd amassed 17 wallets. Our vision pans as the ever-stressed detective offers naught but a nod, racked with a feeling distinct from skepticism. They could prove that, what she said there. And if that were all true, then the suspect was living a life incomparable to our own. They could remove the latter from cause and effect for as long as they deemed fit. Still, that was a stretch, wasn't it? Our soured detective wasn't about to take a supernatural leap of faith. The murder, they said. I think we can assume that it was premeditated then. Our suspect does not deny these allegations. The detective hears something along the lines of, I wanted to know how it felt. I had no motive, not really, other than experimentation. I was in a unique place, they continued. I could answer the question of why without causing any pain. Still in motion, this united eye of ours inches towards the weary detective. Too close, almost. Movement ceases only a second or two before all light is exhausted from our iris, stopping at a level of magnification where we can seemingly witness flecks of dirt clog the detective's wet temple pores. This shot lasts only as long as it takes the detective to dig their nails into their skin, flick away the excess, and then reach for their phone. On that beat, we circle around to their right-hand shoulder and peer over, just to make sure that the conversation is still being recorded. Aloud, the detective pondered the moral obligation of those seeking truth, and whether or not it was guilt that kept the suspect from returning to a state before they had sinned. Their heavy conscience after performing such a dreadful act perhaps had swayed their soul to believe that they should be punished, regardless of their abilities. The suspect disagreed. It wasn't guilt. The suspect didn't feel guilt until they realized that their action was permanent. It was too large of an event, said the suspect. Butterfly effect. Have you heard of that? The detective nods and ushers them into continuing. I made too big of an impact, I think. In the grand scheme of things, I don't mean anything. My friend didn't mean anything, you don't mean anything. But maybe the universe had big plans for Remy Boudroy, and that's why I couldn't go back. Even our wide-angled, less detailed line of sight couldn't disguise the detective's ever-furrowing brow. Time is called, the smartphone is switched off, our ephemeral party settles into its penultimate position, as the detective offers one final, barbed thank you for your time. Unlike us, the suspect remains unfinished. Before you leave, they say, can I show you something? Understandably, the detective's eyes widen for once, and in the pin-drop silence, our collective can almost hear the blood escaping to his feet. Reluctant, perhaps terrified that a thorough search had not been performed, the detective complied, turning back to the suspect. Unwitnessed, however, the suspect has already produced a watch and placed it upon the steel table. We're drawn to it ourselves, a possible heirloom, be it old or simply weathered to look that way. It holds a certain sentimental value to somebody. An item, perhaps, that one wouldn't want to die without, like a soldier and their notebook. Despite everything, the detective perseveres. The watch is inspected in full, and after returning it to the table, the detective removes their own. They turn straight to the inscription on the back. "To my love," the two speak in unison. "Go anywhere but back." Our Unity, a genuine witness to the suspect's ability, as they are directed through a steel-lined corridor. Time has passed, but even now, the suspect's arms remain imprinted by the metal cuffs. Now, a larger pair bind once bloodied hands behind a crooked back. A previous conversation keeps the silent, sterile walk fresh, as the suspect thinks on the detective's final line of questioning. Before our united eyes, the suspect is directed into a room no larger than the spotless bathroom of their bedsit. The cramped chamber holds the technician, and a plastic-wrapped chair of black leather. "I don't understand," the detective had said. "You could have just avoided us forever. Nobody could have predicted your movements, and you're telling me it's not guilt?" From behind, the technician removes the bindings, a momentary grasp at undeserved freedom as the suspect is placed into the solitary seat. Our being shifts from one of floating neutrality to one solidified in motion, as our frame is attached to the suspect's brow and forced to watch the technician's work unfurl. As they set about their duty, the technician retrieves a piece of cracked leather, a distinguishable difference in treatment between it and the chair itself. As it covers the suspect's world and, by proxy, our own, all fades to that familiar redness. Redness soon turns to blackness, and blackness is accompanied by flashes. In those fleeting moments, our suspect relives her crime in full until sirens come once more. Dust wakes the nose, and palm shapes uncover a vision of the interrogation room just once more. You have been listening to Anywhere But Back, an episode of Pulp, Surreal Stories From a Nearby Skull, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2019 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency, and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting the show at patreon.com/sbda.